This is episode 11 of That Shakespeare Life.
That in fact sometimes, or at least it's possible, that there was a printed text as part of the publicity campaign that went alongside the actual performance in real time. So although we don't get any, we don't get any notebook or diary entries that say that Shakespeare had any interest in an authentic version of his plays, there is evidence that the company itself was interested in bringing out print as well as performing the print.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Two of Shakespeare's actors and his friends, presumably, John Heminges and Henry Condell, gave the world copies of Shakespeare's plays we might never have known about otherwise when they compiled the First Folio in 1623. Taking a kind of cynical view of why they might have written these, we wonder whether or not Condell and Heminges was trying to improve on Shakespeare's works. Reprintings of the 17th century often involved improving or changing in multiple reprintings of different plays. Today, Nigel Wood, professor of literature at Loughborough University, joins us to take a look at the history of Shakespeare as theater and as literature, and to discuss the impact of modern Shakespeareans reading what was intended to be performed. I'll be asking Nigel about the significance of stage directions in addition to the written dialogue, why taking apart individual words might matter, and we'll take a look at the meter and rhyme scheme that's made much of in English departments worldwide and whether or not that actually matters when you're performing Shakespeare on stage. Nigel Wood is a professor of literature at Loughborough University, specializing in early modern literature and the staging of dramatic texts. Nigel has edited and contributed to the volumes on The Tempest, The Merchant of Venice, Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, Measure for Measure, Antony and Cleopatra, and Hamlet, as well as other 17th and 18th century works. Essays from this series have been reprinted in over 30 collections of modern critical debate. He has worked as an advisor for the National Theatre and the Royal Shakespeare Company, as well as given lectures at the Shakespeare Institute and Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. In addition to his work as a professor and writer, Nigel has directed several student productions at festivals and tours, both at home and abroad, including Hamlet and The Winter's Tale. Nigel joins us today to discuss the evolution of Shakespeare's plays as a result of reading what was intended to be performed. I will be asking Nigel about the significance of stage directions in addition to the written dialogue and what impact Condell and Heminges' publication of the First Folio might have had on the course of Shakespeare's enduring legacy thereafter. English departments across the world study Shakespeare as one of the greatest writers in history. They pore over his books, diagramming his plays, and taking apart his text word by word. But what have we done to Shakespeare when we read what was intended to be performed? Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist in the world. That is obviously my opinion. But when we take him out of the theater and into the literature department, have we done him a disservice? Today, Nigel Wood, professor of literature at Loughborough University, is joining us to have that conversation and set the record straight about whether or not Shakespeare should be read. Hello, Nigel. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Two of Shakespeare's actors and presumably friends of the bard, John Heminges and Henry Condell, printed the First Folio several years after Shakespeare died. And we know why it was important to posterity that these be printed, but I wonder if you can share with us why it would have been important to Condell and Heminges. Is it odd that their seeming tribute to a lost playwright was to print a book instead of investing in performance or theater work?
One thing we do know about John Heminges is that he was financial manager of the King's Men. That was the theatre company that Shakespeare did most of his work in the Jacobean area with. And I think that it's possible that they saw it as an opportunity to cash in on the celebrity of Shakespeare. It isn't unknown for there to be the publication of works destined really just for the stage. I mean, Ben Jonson in 1616, and he got bad press for this, produced and helped publish his own works, and this was regarded as slightly presumptuous. But on the other hand, what you did was stake a claim to the authenticity of the text. And one of the prefatory pieces of poetry that Heminges and Condell had precede the text of Shakespeare, to the great variety of readers, they make great play with the idea that they are rescuing Shakespeare from basically piracy, from stolen and surreptitious copies. So I suspect that what's happening is that they are trying to make a kind of sell of Shakespeare's works, that before copyright, these are the authentic versions. And indeed, it's true that it's probably going to be the case that we wouldn't have the Macbeth or the Antony and Cleopatra or the Tempest that we now have without their work. I mean, they are, at the end of the day, people who have no real literary authority other than this particular literary act. They're not authors as such. They are working actors and also working administrators for the company. So I can only see it as being a kind of, it's kind of monument to Shakespeare, but it's also one that is probably going to get them economic benefit as well.
Which was my next question about the business of printing plays. I think we give Condell and Heminges this sort of friendly attribute to their reputation of thinking they did this somehow to honor Shakespeare's legacy, but it really could have been just cashing in on, everyone's going to be interested in Shakespeare because of, he died a few years ago, as opposed to, them having a real close friendship. That's a cynical view of it, obviously. But I mean, do you think that they had ulterior motives for putting this out? I mean, I know that sometimes works, even Shakespeare's works, King Lear would be an example of, there are two authorial, versions of the play, which are quite different. And so sometimes plays were reprinted to allow the author to improve on them. Is there any statement that maybe Condell and Heminges were trying to improve on Shakespeare's works by reprinting them, or was this strictly a tribute?
Yeah, I think there's evidence that the versions in the folio, with exceptions, are better, less mistake-ridden copies. So it's apparent, and most critics, most literary scholars who've looked into, doing a contrasting comparison exercise with the quartos that sort of came out every year or so before the folio, they are littered with inconsistencies, usually in sort of speech attribution, sometimes in terms of punctuation. And there's an effort which is evident in what Heminges and Condell did in sort of improving, not completely faultlessly, may I say, but improving the text. There's a scholar called Lucas Erner who's done some work on Shakespeare and the book trade that point out several interesting things. There are certain plays which are really extremely popular. Henry IV, Part 1, Richard III and Richard II. The history plays were obviously very much to Elizabethan Jacobean tastes. But it's only with the folio that you get the fuller version than you get in the kind of 6 or 7 quartos that come out before it. So it's as if what Heminges and Condell are doing are, from the versions that are available, blending them in something approximate to a kind of coherent fashion. So it's not necessarily they're writing down a particular performance. They're doing a kind of creating and combining work on Shakespeare's text. It's also not absolutely sure, when we look at it, that Shakespeare was simply a man of the theatre. For example, there is some research done by Tiffany Stern and also Peter Blaney that in fact sometimes, or at least it's possible, that there was a printed text as part of the publicity campaign that went alongside the actual performance in real time. So although we don't get any, we're not getting notebook or diary entries that say that Shakespeare had any interest in an authentic version of his plays, there is evidence that the company itself was interested in bringing out print as well as performing the print.
Do you mean like a playbill? Like they would have handed out a playbill?
That's right. I mean, it's at least double-headed, the kind of advanced publicity. You've got to realize it's a really competitive market. There are lots of competing, there are 3 competing theatrical repertories at work. Not to say anything about the little children's companies, but for some reasons we can't fathom, suddenly got very popular. So if you stole a march, if you showed some way about flanking the opposition, then of course you took it.
By putting this into this folio and turning, what was a performance piece into literature, I would like your opinion on what changes in our understanding of these plays when we read that which was meant to be performed.
Yeah. I think what we know about the immediate audiences, the first audiences, was that going to see a play was only one of the things that you considered doing when you went to the Globe or the Blackfriars Theatre. We get a sense that only occasionally were they as obedient as 21st century audiences have come to be. And so there were places of assignation, there were places where the groundlings often chatted to themselves. And every now and then, for example, when Mark Antony and Julius Caesar says, "Lend me your ears," it's not just the character speaking, it's actually the actor playing Mark Antony that's doing it. So it's a different clientele, and it's also a different context for how certain kind of performance pieces operate. Occasionally you get little bits of flotsam and jetsam coming above the waves. You get Ben Jonson, for example, in his prefaces, constantly saying, "Well, please, could you listen to my plays?" And of course, when you get performance pieces nowadays, we've got a fairly captive audience. You've got the advantage of spotlit illumination. Now, you wouldn't have that in the afternoon at the Globe, that's for sure, and you probably wouldn't even have it in the private theatres such as Blackfriars. So you've got the need for spectacle. That's the first thing. In Cymbeline, when the mask of Jupiter descends, it's not only because the plot demands it, it's to wake people up. I'm sorry to be so basic.
To keep their attention is a major
absolutely
theater. Yeah.
And I mean, when you think of the great 21st century dramatist, when you think of Sam Shepard, you think of Arthur Miller, you think of Carol Churchill, they can rely on there to be gradual build-up. They can rely on climaxes which occur because they're the result of careful preparation in the language and the stage gestures beforehand. Shakespeare couldn't. All the evidence is that it's a bit of a 3-ring circus. And what Shakespeare's trying to do is just arrest, by whatever means at his disposal, arrest the attention of a very varied audience, by the way, from apprentices to people, to aristocrats, to civil servants. For some reason, the account of that audience is of a very, very, hydra-headed multitude, People you can't always predict are going to react in a consistent way as well.
I mean, you're mentioning the head of Jupiter descending and different things that we know about through stage directions in the printed copies of the plays that we have, but obviously playgoers there at the Globe wouldn't have read these beforehand. They would be walking in there and experiencing this. Yeah. For the first time. Are we, sort of cheating the system or getting, spoilers or what have you, if by reading through these plays before we've seen them performed?
Well, the trouble is most of us have already got a sense of who Shakespeare is. And so the shock value is always going to be muted because he's part of our inherited culture. But I think there are certain ways that Shakespeare relied on a certain amount of understanding of certain tropes. For example, the blinding of Gloucester in King Lear which, Act 3 is scene 7 of the history, but in the tragedy it's scene 14. Now, it's an obvious reference to the blinding of Oedipus, but of course the Oedipus blinding occurs off stage. But the blinding of Gloucester double bluffs an audience by having it occur before us in real time as part of the display. And it seems to me that Shakespeare is relying on a certain kind of savviness or prior knowledge, not necessarily of where he's going to go with his plays, but an understanding of allusion in some ways. And it works in different ways. For example, the source text for Merchant of Venice has Shylock as the Jew. That's all. And the problem that Shakespeare encountered was an audience who'd hardly come across Jews as such. In fact, Jews are supposed to have been banished from England. So the exoticism of Shylock is being exploited. And yet he refuses to treat Shylock in that play as he has it in the source text. Shylock is given a wife who's just died. Leah is given another Jew, Tubal, to talk to. And so consequently, he's humanized in ways that we forget when we understand that he's so badly treated by the Gentiles. And so what opens up in performance is the possibility that it's very Janus-faced. It works both ways. Surely what happens with Gratiano, and to some extent Bassanio, is an over-the-top chauvinism which is shown towards Shylock. And I've often said that the same sort of thing might happen at the end of Taming of the Shrew, when obviously feminists would home in, and quite understandably, Catherine's subservience, absurd subservience to Petruchio. She places her hand on the stage for Petruchio's foot to stamp upon. And yet at the same time, Shakespeare makes that as a new ingredient, makes that part of the winning of a bet against her sister, Bianca. So in performance, it doesn't just work in a straight line. And I think the more you look at Shakespeare's texts, the more you realize they're not programmatic in the normal sense.
No, well, because a director would have, the freedom to interpret what's there in.
Yes.
I mean, there's a big gap between what's on the page and how it looks on stage, which what do you think that means about the whole field of original practice and bringing that technique into performance? Do you think that using original practice techniques brings us closer to what Shakespeare would have put on stage?
I think we can. I mean, I think the Globe experiment, although I have to say, since Mark Rylance's directorship of the Globe, some of the experimental ideas have sort of fallen into the background. There's no rudimentary lighting and so on. But in the utilization of space at the Globe, and there are other globes, by the way, I do know of other globes in the US and in Canada, have in fact discovered things about how the theatre space of the Globe was actually very, very flexible, far more flexible than we had thought initially. There are lots of areas where we could actually suggest change of location and scene, between Alexandria and Rome and Antony and Cleopatra. It's far more sinuous than we'd perhaps given it credit for. But I think there's another problem with authenticity, and that is that if we were to imagine a Shakespeare being alive today, he would not necessarily have done anything with an art form that is so embedded within heritage culture. He'd be a digital artist. He'd be hitching his talent to something that was truly emergent and where the rules of engagement weren't verified, at least not yet. So the authenticity, I mean, there is a drawing of the only, as far as we can tell, the only contemporary performance. And it's the Longleat drawing. We don't know who did it, but it's in Longleat House in Hampshire. And it's of a scene which must have been fictional, from Titus Andronicus. Fictional because not everybody on stage could have been on stage in the one scene as we have it from the folio text. But there we have togas, to suggest Rome, casually slung over doublet and hose. So you could make a case for the fact that if you want to be authentic about Shakespeare, then it's approximate to our more modern attempts at doing eclectic drama. That's nearer, if you like, the, in inverted commas, authenticity, which we usually get from unrelievedly doublet and hose Shakespeare. I'm a little, how can I put it, a little skeptical about the value of authenticity of the practices then.
So, for example, when Ian McClellan recently played Prospero in an audiobook version of The Tempest, you think that that's enough to be counted as authentic representation of Shakespeare's story, is simply for the text to be performed out loud? Or do you think there is a stage aspect that's essential to what Shakespeare's doing?
Well, I mean, there is another test. I mean, I teach drama students as well as English students, and it's not as if they're really into different games or different assessment criteria. But one of the things that has been borne on to me, who started teaching English students, I graduated with an English degree, is that the most authentic thing you can come up with is something that is interesting and dramatically captivating. And if reading aloud, it's like heritage Shakespeare. It's like the BBC Shakespeares from the 1980s, which were pretty good commemorations for people who didn't know the text. But as interesting readings of the text, they weren't very exciting, I mean, for example, you take it to an extreme in terms of the adaptation. You could say that John Gielgud in Derek Jarman's Prospero's books, directed by Peter Greenaway back in 1991, is a reading aloud. But vivacity with which that is given a context means it's a truly dramatic event. A simple recital doesn't mean that all that Shakespeare put into the playtext is realized. It's commemorative, it's ritualized, but those aspects of dramatic effect that aren't dependent on ritualization it's impossible to realize them. Not even how much intonation you put in the spoken voice, it won't do it, because it's in 3D, it's gesture, it's the ordinance of people on stage, it's that kind of thing. And those are all important.
The text of Shakespeare was designed to play a role in the performance, though. I mean, iambic pentameter was intentional. Why would Shakespeare use that particular medium scheme?
If you think about the resources that could be at his disposal, the kind of almost doggerel rhetoric of a Gorboduc, or some of the excesses of the allegorical drama of morality plays, sort of couldn't capture a sense of, should we say, formal realism. Iambic pentameter is the nearest you can get to combining an element of form with a sense of the spoken voice as you might find it outside the theatre. It only over a period of time do you realize there's a form at work with iambic pentameter. And what Shakespeare can do at his best is show us an element of contrast. For example, when Hamlet comes back to Elsinore in Act 5, there is a relaxed element to the iambic pentameter which isn't there back in Act 3. It's slightly more regular. It's where the caesuras are more regularly placed, and so on. And the same might be true, of Cleopatra as she's about to apply the asp to her breast, that suddenly we get a sense through the words and through also the rhythm that she's achieved a moment of ripeness and acceptance, because there are no jagged pieces in the language. And I think iambic pentameter works like that. It's very, very valent. It can move from the representation of high excitement to a sense of decision. And I think that is why it accompanies Shakespeare's attempt to bring a form, not a facsimile realism, but a form of realism onto the stage.
You mentioned your English degree earlier, and I have a degree in English also. And I remember in class having, being asked to to diagram the feat of iambs and study iambic pentameter very closely.
Yeah.
But I wonder, even though it remains effective during performance, I wonder if the theater goer who has not gotten an English degree really recognizes that as an important part of Shakespeare. Do you think that particular poetry scheme matters to the audience?
Well, I think it matters as a kind of as an effect. Let's put it like that. I mean, when we scan, I've done practical criticism exercises where we've scanned. And what we've done, we've tried to, as it were, understand the tricks of the trade of the author, of the poet. We've tried to find out where there has been a certain determination to play along or play against, in some counterpoint, metrical regularity and form. But an audience can't assimilate that and shouldn't assimilate that, or they're not being sufficiently immersed in the dramatic action. What they get is the effect of it. And I think that it's all very well thinking about motivation and so on, but when you're in the point of being in a dramatic performance in real time is that you should be receptive enough not to think about those prior considerations about motivation. You should be letting it wash over you. Later, you can analyze it, but probably not at the moment that you're an audience member and a spectator.
So similar to the idea that you may not recognize the physics of the pulley system lowering Jupiter's head, but you can still be impacted by that effect, as you said, on stage. The iambic pentameter plays a similar performance role in that.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, the Masque of Jupiter is, in fact, fairly regular, very stately, masque-like poetry. It is, in fact. And it accompanies a very elevated form, a very surprising form of intervention, And I think in that example, that is where you could segue into a rather very stately form of the iambic pentameter. But when you've got Ophelia in Hamlet, or you've got Antony under stress, it may still be iambic pentameter, but we see it warring against that stateliness. In fact, it's a completely different effect you get from it. Yeah.
Well, scripts in general, even ones that are not written in a particular rhyme scheme, are hard to sit down and read in the same way that somebody would sit down and read a novel. Do you think that the fact that we've tried to force performance pieces to be literature has added to Shakespeare's reputation of being a hard subject?
I suppose so. And I think what also makes it hard is the fact that you feel you've got a mountain to climb because you feel you ought to like Shakespeare. He's part of the plus points, in our culture. You go and see a Shakespeare, and before you actually get to the point where you're there live, enjoying the drama itself, you've got a lot of lumber to get through. And it's why, actually, it's entirely possible that the more radical and far-reaching effects of, say, a production of Hamlet could be achieved in a public house back room on the Edinburgh Fringe than even at the Royal National Theatre or on Broadway or in the West End or at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon, because the pressures on the whole cast, the pressures on the director to come up with what fits a cultural niche are so much stronger. In the 60s and 70s, the most radical, by all accounts, I only saw a couple of them, the most radical form of history play was undertaken by Polish directors. And it was because they enjoyed a certain freedom from the pressures of Anglo-American expectation. They could adapt it according to contemporary needs. And I think that's the idea behind a playtext, that the most popular playtexts are often those that aren't nailed down. They aren't the ones with voluminous stage directions. They are the ones where just enough, suggestively, is offered future interpreters to do with what they want, and yet still remain fairly faithful to the original inspiration.
Well, I think of other modern directors that I enjoy their work. And I know there's debate about whether Shakespeare functioned as a director in the modern sense. And so without going that way, what I mean to draw attention to is the idea that no one would study Steven Spielberg's films by going and reading his scripts. They would go and see the movies. And so I wonder, similarly, if we're doing Shakespeare something of an injustice by taking him into the literature category. Do you think we've miscategorized his work as literature? Does he belong instead in the theater department of our universities?
I think that's a good point, but I think the complexity of the answer is the fact that sometimes you can only get the complexity of what Shakespeare fed into his works by work in the study as opposed to the auditorium. When I've done post-performance seminars with groups that have been to see the play, their understanding of the play is really guided by the interpretation of the one representation that they've just seen, the one set of decisions by the director or the company. So are they really seeing the play in anything like its entirety? I suspect they are not. But on the other hand, Shakespeare is live entertainment. And the problem is, anything that inhibits our ability to be immersed in it, it's almost as if you've got to unlearn bits of Shakespeare when you go and see a new Shakespearean production. For example, I'm due to go and see in 2 weeks' time yet another performance of Macbeth. I've seen, I would say, between 30 and 40 different versions of Macbeth in my play-going career. Now, I have to say that with a certain repetition, the chances of a real surprise that's about to come to me, plus the fact that I regularly teach it, are getting slimmer and slimmer. But I do live in hope, because how the witches are going to be portrayed. Now, that's a $64,000 question, and there's no definitive answer to it.
And everybody's different. I've never seen them do it the same way here or there. Yeah.
That's absolutely right. And also the feeling in an auditorium can sometimes be different. Between studio, between large-scale auditorium. You know, these kinds of things, even if they're implicit and possibly unconscious, add something that you can't always capture in DVD, you know, as to what's happening.
Yes. So it speaks something to Shakespeare's talent as an artist that you can hand the same script to several different companies and you're never going to see the same play.
That's right. That's right. It's a case of contrast and compare. For example, I would imagine that if you went to see a George Bernard Shaw play, the spectrum of possibilities that would supply surprise might still be there, but it wouldn't be very large. And it certainly wouldn't be as large, even in a Pinter or a Beckett. It's to do with how they were produced. It's to do with the fact that they are very miniaturized forms of entertainment, where it's auteur-led. It's auteur-led, in other words. But Shakespeare, even as Ben Jonson was, are immersed in a joint stock venture. And that means that there is always a latitude of interpretation which is allowed an audience. As long as they're audible, you know, that's fine. But the audience is expected to play their part by using their own powers of imagination and invention.
Well, I have a few questions not directly related to Shakespeare in performance and how reading versus performance plays into our understanding of him. And we ask these of all our guests here at That Shakespeare Life, just because what we try to do here is to start a good conversation about Shakespeare and encourage people to learn more. So my first question for you is to think about the books you've read the last couple of years. What would you say are one or two titles that immediately come to mind as having had the biggest impact on you?
Well, two quite recent books, which... I mean, I'm part of a research group that very proclaims itself to be investigating the arts in the public sphere. In other words, the idea that any artifact, we have to be free when we regard it as far as possible, free of expectation, free of compulsion. And there's a book by Christopher Balme, B-A-L-M-E, called The Theatrical Public Sphere. I think it came out about 2013, something like that. And in that, he draws an attention to the full context by which one comes into contact with a theatrical event actually contributes to the significance of that event. And it's often very unconscious, unconscious to us. And I think that he does a very good job of trying to establish different public spheres. We're very often unconscious of them, but I think that's very good. And it follows on from a book that I very much took a great deal from. It's by Stephen Mullaney, called The Place of the Stage. And it's quite old. I think it was revised in 1995, but it was first published in 1988. And what Stephen Mullaney points out, that if you were an early spectator and you went to see a play at the Globe Theatre, for example, you were moving outside the city walls. You were already voting with your feet. You passed basically hospices for the incurably sick from leprosy. You passed brothels. You were in danger of pickpockets, so you had probably somebody with a sword to accompany you if you didn't have a sword yourself. Your brocades got dirty because it was unmetalled, the roads that you went to, the paths you went to. If you were a woman, you really had to dress accordingly because you didn't necessarily want to come away with dirty clothes at the end of it. And so these feed into, aspects of how performance came across then. There's a famous example of the fact that what was discovered was that the early Globe was only two, houses away, two sites away from a bear baiting arena. So when in that famous stage direction of Winter's Tale, when exit pursued by a bear, the more lifelike that bear was, the more the audience might have thought, Christ, it might be a bear that's actually escaped from two sites down, So these are all very important aspects of how Shakespeare constructed his plays and relied on the contemporary sense of his audience. And I would say they're quite interesting reads. They're well written, but they're quite interesting reads into trying to decipher that original context.
Well, what is your best advice for an aspiring Shakespearean? What do you think is the best way to study Shakespeare?
I teach a module with some drama students called Contemporary Shakespeare. And actually this comes up very prominently as we, go through Shakespeare. Some of them are only encountering Shakespeare for the first time, may I say. And one of the bits of advice, one of my favorite books that I discovered in the preparation for this module is by David Mamet, Advice to Actors. And he says two things. He says, firstly, theatre is a process very often of unlearning, right? You've got to unlearn a lot of the stuff that is the lumber of tradition in order to get to genuine engagement through drama. And the second thing is that there's no substitute but to embody the language, whatever that means. But I'm taking them in loads of things, right?
Yes, I think
you've got to make it your own. You see. Absolutely. And you haven't got to listen to somebody else's embodiment, because you've got to achieve a point where it's you individually, without outside aid, that's embodying the language. And I think if you can get to that point, you're doing okay.
Well, what's next for you? What are you and your team working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm interested in those plays that are hardly ever studied, less studied and less produced. And I call it a project called Rare Shakespeare. And these are the ones that have often in the past been considered unproducible or clumsy. I mean, plays like Cymbeline, King John, Pericles even, although Pericles has made a comeback, may I say, and All's Well That Ends Well. All's Well That Ends Well is a problematic play, and it's often associated with being a problem play as far as the critical canon is concerned. And the fact of the matter is, it doesn't give us, in a very clear sense, a romantic pairing of Helena and Bertram. Bertram doesn't seem to improve from being the spoilt little boy in the first act. Whereas Helena seems to be suggested by Shakespeare as if she could be interpreted as being a scheming minx. She gets what she wants. She's at best middle class, and she gets into the aristocratic crowd, but she does it by hoodwinking Bertram. And if you really look closely at the end of All's Well That Ends Well, it's remarkably subjunctive in mood. You know what I mean? I mean, we don't actually see the wedding take place, but we rarely do in Shakespeare. But
you're left to make your own decisions.
You've got to make your own decision, exactly. And I'm interested in those little gaps where, in order to really justify itself as, a thoroughgoing tragedy or a thoroughgoing romantic comedy, Shakespeare doesn't give us what we want. So I'm interested in that, and how we can develop complexity on the stage with that.
Well, I know you've given us a lot to think about in terms of performance and Shakespeare, and I appreciate very much you lending your time and expertise to our conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and I hope it's of some use. Okay,
yes,
Catherine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
To get up close and personal with some of the history you learned about in today's episode, you can travel with That Shakespeare Girl in September 2019. I have partnered with British History Tours to offer the ultimate Shakespeare experience. It's 8 days in London and Stratford, seeing where William Shakespeare worked, lived, and how he built his enduring legacy. We'll see places like the Globe Theatre, and you'll learn all about staging and performance and his life living in London and Stratford. To get all the details and to sign up to be notified when tickets go on general release later this year, visit cassidycash.com/travel Shakespeare.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at cassidycash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.